Ridgewell was a town that prided itself on safety, where neighbors knew each other and doors were left unlocked. But that peace shattered when a series of disappearances gripped the town in fear. The first to vanish was Daniel Harper, the dependable mail carrier, who never returned home one quiet evening. Then came Emily Lawson, a college student, walking home from her part-time job, disappearing without a trace. Even Greg Thompson, a night shift security guard, vanished mysteriously, leaving only small, perfectly drawn chalk circles behind. At first, the police, led by Detective Sarah Reynolds, dismissed these clues as coincidence, but the symbols kept appearing, haunting every street dot as investigators worked. They discovered a chilling connection. Every victim had reported minor incidents weeks before disappearing lost items, strange noises, or suspicious figures. The patterns pointed to someone who moved unnoticed, someone who knew the town better than anyone. Their investigation led them to Harold Whitman, a retired janitor who had lived in Ridgewell for decades, invisible in plain sight. Inside his home, the police found detailed maps, hidden notes, and a cassette tape ominously labeled "My Final Message." Ridgewell was the kind of town where people believed danger belonged only in distant cities. Days moved slowly, and life followed a predictable rhythm. Children rode bikes past quiet homes, neighbors chatted over fences, and the local market closed early because nothing bad ever happened after dark. That sense of safety was so deeply rooted that people rarely locked their doors, trusting that the town's calm nature would always protect them. But that trust began to break the day the disappearances started, unsettling the very foundation Ridgewell was built on. The first missing person was a mail carrier, who knew every road and every family in town. He never missed a shift and was respected for his reliability. When he failed to return home one evening, his co-workers assumed his truck had broken down. The police sent out a quick search team, expecting to find him with a flat tire or a dead battery. Instead, they found his truck parked neatly by the side of a quiet street, the engine off, doors unlocked, and keys still inside. Nothing was damaged, nothing was stolen, and nothing hinted at where he had gone. The only unusual thing was a small chalk circle drawn on the pavement behind the vehicle. At the time, officers dismissed it as a child's drawing, thinking little of it. A week later, a college student vanished on her way home from a part-time job. She lived only a few blocks from the cafe where she worked, and she usually sent her parents a message when she arrived. This time, the message never came. Her phone was found lying near a bench in a nearby park, screen cracked, battery dead. Again, there was no sign of struggle, no footprints, and no clues pointing toward a possible suspect. But just like before, investigators found a chalk circle, this time on the base of the bench. It looked deliberately drawn, clean and perfectly shaped, almost as if someone had taken their time creating it. People began whispering about the strange symbol, wondering whether it was connected to the disappearances. The police publicly denied any link, insisting that they needed more evidence. They warned the community not to panic. Still, the fear spread quickly, especially after the third disappearance. A night shift security guard at a small manufacturing plant failed to check in during his usual midnight call. When his supervisor went to look for him, the guardroom was empty. His flashlight lay on the floor, still switched on, and the security monitors showed nothing unusual. Outside, near the back entrance of the building, officers found yet another chalk circle, bright and fresh as if drawn only minutes earlier. Now, the residents of Ridgewell could no longer pretend these events were random. Rumors took over conversations in grocery aisles, schools, and coffee shops. Some believed a cult had moved into town. Others feared a serial predator was living among them, watching from the shadows. Parents kept their children indoors, and people who once welcomed strangers now avoided eye contact with anyone they didn't know. For a place so used to peace, the shift in atmosphere felt suffocating. As days passed with no answers, tension tightened around Ridgewell like an invisible grip. The police increased patrols and set up community alerts, but reassurance was hard to give when they themselves were shaken by the lack of leads. Each new day brought anxiety, and each new night carried the threat of another disappearance. And always, in every case, the chalk circle waited as the only silent evidence, simple, small, but growing more sinister with every incident. Investigators worked tirelessly to understand the strange pattern unfolding across Ridgewell, but progress was slow and frustrating. Each new clue seemed to lead nowhere, and each disappearance left behind the same eerie calling card. The chalk circles had become the center of every conversation, and although police tried to prevent panic, the town couldn't ignore what was happening. People who had lived their entire lives without fear were now double-checking their windows at night. The sense of safety that Ridgewell once proudly carried had cracked wide open, and the darkness creeping in felt closer every day. The investigative team began by comparing the victims' lives in detail. They examined their daily routines, their social connections, and their backgrounds. At first, nothing stood out. The victims were different ages, worked different jobs, and lived in different parts of town. There was no shared workplace, no social circle, no overlapping friend groups. It almost seemed as though the disappearances had been chosen at random. But as investigators dug deeper, a pattern slowly began to take shape, one that had gone unnoticed because of how small and insignificant it seemed. Each victim had reported a minor disturbance in the weeks before they disappeared. The mail carrier had called in a complaint about a missing bag of letters from his route. The college student had mentioned a strange figure watching her from across the street late at night. The security guard had filed a report about tools going missing from the storage area he supervised. The incidents hadn't been serious enough to raise alarms at the time, but now, placed side by side, they hinted at something more organized. Someone had been testing boundaries, approaching these individuals long before taking them. Once this pattern was identified, the investigation team began reviewing all recent small complaints made within Ridgewell. The list was longer than expected. Reports included items missing from porches, strange noises around homes, unexplained footprints near windows, and unfamiliar cars seen on quiet streets. What had once been dismissed as harmless everyday nuisances suddenly looked like the early steps of something far more sinister. The team created a large map on the wall of their temporary command center, marking locations where complaints had been filed and where chalk circles had been found. The dots began forming a shape that looked too deliberate to be coincidence. As knowledge of the growing pattern spread, Ridgewell changed almost overnight. People who once enjoyed evening walks now rushed home before sunset. Neighbors who had chatted freely over fences now suspiciously watched one another. Houses that had never needed security systems suddenly installed cameras and motion lights. Local shops even began selling boxes of chalk so residents could compare it with the mysterious circles. Hoping to find some kind of clue on their own, the police department received an overwhelming number of calls from people claiming they'd seen chalk marks on sidewalks, driveways, or even building walls. Many of these reports turned out to be children's doodles or ordinary markings, but officers responded to each one, unwilling to take any chances. Fear had reached a point where no detail seemed too small, and no concern was ignored. Despite constant effort, the investigators still lacked concrete evidence about the person responsible. Every chalk circle seemed intentionally placed to unsettle the community, but none pointed clearly to a suspect. It was as if the person behind it all enjoyed watching the town unravel in confusion. What unsettled authorities the most was how the circles began appearing in new places, far from where the victims had lived or worked. It felt as though the unknown figure was expanding, spreading their influence across Ridgewell bit by bit, as if marking territory. The deeper the police looked, the more they felt they were being outmaneuvered by someone who understood the town better than they did. Someone patient, calculating, and eerily comfortable staying hidden. What began as scattered incidents had turned into a chilling game, and Ridgewell was caught in the center of it without understanding the rules. Only one thing felt certain. The person behind the chalk circles wasn't finished yet. The breakthrough came on a rainy afternoon when investigators were reviewing old evidence photographs. The rain had been heavy the night before, strong enough to wash away chalk markings and disturb loose soil. Officers were called to check an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Ridgewell after a passerby reported seeing a figure moving around inside. By the time police arrived, the building was silent. The door hung slightly open, swaying in the wind as if someone had left in a hurry. Inside, the floor was wet, and the storm had pushed water through broken windows, creating muddy puddles across the concrete. At first glance, it looked like any other vacant structure left forgotten by time. But then an officer noticed something near the loading dock, a footprint embedded in a patch of drying mud. The print was crisp and clean, almost too perfect for a rain-soaked day. It looked as though someone had intentionally placed their foot there after the storm had passed. The shape was unusual, the kind of mark left by a boot with a distinctive sole pattern. Investigators documented it carefully, aware that this was the first physical clue they had found after months of dead ends. What unsettled them most was the idea that the footprint may not have been accidentally left behind. It felt like a message, a sign that the person responsible knew the police were closing in and wanted to stay one step ahead. Inside the warehouse, officers began a thorough search. The building was cold and empty, with rooms filled only by dust and the echoes of their movements. But as they walked deeper into the back section, they found something that turned the investigation upside down. Behind a sheet of warped plywood was a hidden room. The entrance was narrow, almost invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Inside this space were objects that made it clear the victims had been held here before they vanished. A pair of shoes belonging to the college student was found in one corner. Near it lay a torn jacket that matched the description of the mail carrier's last outfit. Even more disturbing were the deep scratches on the concrete wall, each marking overlapping the next, as if someone had desperately tried to leave a sign of their presence. Personal items were scattered around a watch missing its strap, a broken necklace chain, and a set of keys with a faded store loyalty card attached. Each piece confirmed that the warehouse had been central to the crimes all along. The room felt strangely organized, as if someone regularly came back to rearrange or remove items. It didn't resemble the lair of someone reckless. It was a space managed by someone who wanted to maintain control over every detail. On a dusty table in the corner of the room, investigators discovered the most crucial piece of evidence, a small notebook. Its cover was plain, worn from repeated handling. Inside, pages were filled with scribbled notes, dates, initials, locations, and short phrases that made little sense at first. The entry spanned months, maybe years. Some of the dates matched the days the victims had gone missing. Next to each set of initials was a symbol that looked eerily similar to the chalk circles found around town. As officers flipped through the notebook, they reached the final page. It was different from the rest, written in bold, uneven strokes that looked as if the writer's hand had been trembling or rushed. The message read, "The last one will tell my story." It was unclear who the last one referred to or what story the writer believed needed telling. The phrase carried a heavy sense of purpose, as if everything so far had been leading up to a final act the investigators had yet to understand. The discovery left the team with more questions than answers. Why leave such a book behind? Why reveal a hidden location after months of remaining undetected? And most importantly, what did the final message mean? As heavy clouds gathered over Ridgewell again, the investigators realized they were dealing with someone who wasn't just dangerous, but someone who wanted to be understood. The warehouse was no longer just a crime scene. It was the beginning of a much larger unraveling. The notebook changed the direction of the investigation completely. Every entry hinted at someone who moved through Ridgewell unnoticed, someone who watched from a distance while blending into everyday life. Detectives began comparing the dates and initials in the notebook with community records. Many of the noted locations had been job sites, maintenance areas, or public facilities that only certain workers had regular access to. A pattern emerged pointing toward someone who performed manual tasks around town, someone whose job allowed them to move freely without raising suspicion. This realization slowly led investigators to a retired janitor who had lived in Ridgewell for decades. He had worked in schools, offices, and public buildings, quietly completing tasks no one paid attention to. His presence had been so ordinary that people rarely noticed him. Over the years, he had become a familiar background figure, the kind of person everyone trusted without question. When investigators dug into his past, several strange details surfaced. He had changed addresses often despite never leaving Ridgewell. He had taken long walks at odd hours and frequently volunteered to handle tasks that required access to hidden or restricted areas. None of this seemed criminal on its own, but together it formed an unsettling picture. When detectives searched his small home near the edge of town, they found nothing unusual at first. The house was neat, with shelves lined with old tools and supplies from his years of work. Everything looked ordinary, but a locked drawer at the bottom of a wooden cabinet caught their attention. After carefully forcing it open, they discovered maps of Ridgewell. Each map had chalk circles drawn in specific locations, spots where victims had disappeared, places where strange complaints had been filed, and even areas the police hadn't considered significant. The maps were arranged by year, showing a slow but deliberate expansion of marked areas. It was clear the circles were not random symbols scattered without meaning. They formed a pattern that gave the impression of someone planning movements long before acting on them. This careful preparation suggested someone who didn't just commit crimes, but studied the town like a puzzle. The realization made the investigators uneasy. They were no longer dealing with a person acting impulsively, but someone who had spent years observing Ridgewell like a personal world they believed they controlled. Inside the drawer, alongside the maps, was a single cassette tape. The label was handwritten with shaky markings that read, "My final message." It was placed carefully beside a small tin of chalk, the same kind used to mark the circles found across town. The presence of the tape felt deliberate, as if it was meant to be discovered only when the investigation had reached this point. The tape was sealed in a plastic sleeve, free from dust, meaning it had likely been prepared recently. As investigators searched the rest of the house, they found old uniforms, keys to multiple public buildings, and notebooks filled with short observations about people around town. The notes were unsettlingly detailed, describing daily routines, habits, and movements of residents who had once been victims or who had filed minor complaints that now seemed more meaningful. Each page revealed how deeply he had inserted himself into the unnoticed corners of everyday life. The discovery shook Ridgewell. People struggled to accept that someone they had trusted for years had quietly built a hidden world beneath their daily routines. The idea that a seemingly ordinary man had been studying the town so intensely made the situation even more terrifying. The search of his home confirmed he had been planning for far longer than anyone imagined, and his disappearance before police arrived suggested he had anticipated every step the investigators would take. What remained most disturbing was the tape he had left behind, a final piece of the puzzle that everyone feared would reveal more than they were prepared to hear. The cassette tape was taken to the police department and carefully examined. Investigators expected a confession, or perhaps a description of what had driven the man to commit such disturbing acts. But when they finally played it, what they heard was far more unsettling than anyone imagined. The recording did not begin with a name or an explanation. Instead, it opened with the faint sound of slow breathing, steady and controlled, as though the speaker wanted to make his presence known before speaking. After several long seconds, the voice began, calm and measured, as if speaking to an audience he believed would one day understand him. He did not describe the victims or the crimes directly. Instead, he spoke about fear, how it shaped people, how it influenced decisions, and how it revealed the hidden sides of human nature. He talked about Ridgewell as if it belonged to him, calling it a perfect stage where small disruptions could change the entire rhythm of the community. He described the chalk circles not as symbols of violence, but as reminders of how easily order could be disturbed by something simple. According to him, the circles had never been meant to scare at first, but over time, he realized how powerful they were. They became a way to test how closely people paid attention to the spaces around them. As the recording continued, his tone shifted. He spoke about watching the town over the years, learning its patterns, memorizing its routines, and predicting how people would react under pressure. He claimed that each disappearance was not about ending lives, but about removing pieces from a game. He never explained what happened to the victims after they vanished. He only hinted that they were part of a purpose he believed no one else could understand. The lack of detail made the tape even more disturbing. It suggested that he saw the victims not as people, but as elements in a plan he had carefully constructed. The most chilling part came near the end of the tape. His voice grew quieter, almost reflective, as he explained that he had chosen one final person. This individual, he said, would not be harmed. Instead, this person would carry his story forward. He claimed that the final victim was essential to completing the message he wanted Ridgewell to hear. He never revealed who the person was, only saying that the chalk circle had already been placed near their home. The recording ended with a repeated phrase spoken with increasing intensity. "The last one is already chosen." Investigators stopped the tape and immediately organized a large-scale search. They checked every neighborhood for fresh chalk markings. Hours later, in a quiet residential area near the outskirts of town, they found a newly drawn circle on a driveway. The home belonged to a middle-aged accountant who had reported a minor garage break-in 2 weeks earlier. When officers entered the house, they discovered it empty. Lights were still on, a meal sat half-prepared on the kitchen counter, and the front door was slightly ajar. There were no signs of struggle, but the owner was gone. The news shook Ridgewell more than any earlier disappearance. This time, the victim had been taken after the killer's home had been discovered, and after the tape had been left behind. It meant the man had anticipated the investigation's progress. He had planned for it. The police launched a massive search operation, but days turned into weeks with no trace of the missing resident or the retired janitor. As time passed, fear settled permanently into the town. People moved away, businesses closed early, and the once lively community became quiet and watchful. Even after months of searching, no new chalk circles appeared, no bodies were found, and no additional clues surfaced. The killer had vanished completely, leaving Ridgewell trapped between unanswered questions and lingering dread. The tape remained the final piece of his legacy, a message that offered no closure and no clear motive. To this day, the last victim has never been found. Some believe the killer fled far away, while others think he still hides somewhere close, watching the town he once studied so carefully. Ridgewell has tried to move forward, but the memory of the chalk circles and the words on the tape continue to haunt every quiet street. The story never truly ended, just as he intended, leaving a shadow that the town cannot escape.